So we start this morning on a mission trip. Paul, Timothy, and Silas are doing the work of spreading the gospel in what we today call Syria and Turkey. When Paul has a dream, calling him to Macedonia, come and help us. Now, call narratives are integral to the Bible. They're those moments when God intervenes, gives direction, moves the action forward. They are those moments when folks are given a choice to participate in God's work in our world. And of course, calls don't just happen to the great figures of our faith history. We are called all the time to be part of the work. And responding to a call, it takes faith. The first of the Christian virtues that Paul mentions in his first letter to the Corinthians. Paul could have woken up and gone to Timothy and Silas and said, guys, you won't believe this crazy dream I had last night. And they could have responded by saying, yeah, Paul, that's weird. And that could have been it. But for a call to be realized, it has to be responded to. That takes faith. That commitment, that conviction that however strange and unexpected and inconvenient, God has chosen us to do some work. And they do respond. We immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. And so they go. On the strength of a dream and a belief that God was working on them and through them. And that brings us to another Christian virtue, the one that Paul lifts up as the most important, and that is love. Love is what we do in our various callings. It is the work of God in the world. It was love for the people of Macedonia that drove Paul and Timothy and Silas forward. It was love that prompted Lydia to open our house to them. When we respond to a call, we are accepting the responsibility to be God's love in the world. But this call to Macedonia, this is going to be a tough one. If we move on from our passage this morning, we immediately find these three guys in trouble. And soon, we find them in jail. Now, I hope your call never lands you where they land. But I cannot promise you that your call won't place you in some jeopardy or another. I can't promise you that your call will be unencumbered by doubt or even by despair. We do our work in the world, and the world can be a weighty place. And that leads us to the third of Paul's Christian virtues. It's the one that tends to be ignored. We all get that centrality of faith. Faith is language that we understand. And we know that we are called to love, even if we don't always understand just how radical a call that is. But we sometimes forget the importance of hope. It's the middle child of the Christian virtues, and like many middle children, it must sometimes feel neglected. But folks, hope is the energy on which a call depends. Very few of us can labor for long where we have no hope. If we come to believe that our work has no purpose and that our call cannot ever bear fruit, it's next to impossible to see it through. Hopelessness is the enemy of discipleship. So as we live out that discipleship It's important to keep before us a vision of what may be. It's important to remind ourselves that God's reality is not our reality, and that through God all things are possible. I think that's especially important for us today. I don't say uniquely important to us because it's been important to other people at other times, but it is especially important. We know that those who have come before us have lived in dark times and have faithfully carried out God's work in the midst of those times. But that can be small comfort when we feel our own wells of hope drying up. We live in a time and a place where hope seems in short supply, where hatred has inexorably become the rhetoric of our public life, where the fear of those not like us has been made into political capital, and where our flags seem permanently stuck at half-mast. And I want to acknowledge that. And I'm grateful to Heather for acknowledging it as well. I want to acknowledge that it can seem pointless to be the church in a time when our efforts seem ineffective. And when the things that we are supposed to value as followers of Christ seem to be valued so very little in the world around us. And that brings us to our second passage from the book of Revelation. As I was preparing for this morning, I was reminded that Revelation was one of two books of the Bible that John Calvin never preached on. And believe me, I get that. It is a fever dream of a book and has been the source of so many fringe theologies and the inspiration for some of the darker moments in our shared history. It's a difficult book to get a handle on, and I was sorely tempted to give the reading a pass. But it does deserve our attention. And a little bit of background. Current scholarship is largely in agreement that this book, Revelation, was composed during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian by a man named John who had been imprisoned on the island of Patmos because of his religious beliefs. Domitian's reign is an important backdrop because after some inner turmoil in the Roman Empire, Domitian had promised to make Rome great again. And central to that vision was a religious policy that outlawed foreign practices, as well as compelling the worship of traditional Roman deities. In this atmosphere, Christians, whose legal status had actually been a matter of some fluidity during the reigns of earlier emperors, were definitively cast as enemies of the state. Now, Revelation has often been read as a book of predictions, a mystical account of world history and the end of times. And I've never been comfortable with that reading. And I've really never been comfortable with the interpretations that it spawned. I don't see the book as a book of predictions primarily. I think it is rather an acknowledgement of the grim reality in the time that John was living. And certainly John doesn't pull any punches in calling out the evil of his day throughout this book. It is that, but it is also, and you need to hear this, it is also a message of hope for his fellow believers, living through a time of hopelessness. John knew that this still young movement was at a crucial inflection point, and that giving in to despair, which would have seemed natural, would also be deadly. And so, interlaced with his apocalypticism, with those weird visions of angels with flaming swords and scrolls sealed by 7 seals, there are moments like our reading from this morning, moments of lyrical beauty, suffused with a vision of God's kingdom. See, John is giving his followers the necessary energy to live into their callings, even given the real frustrations and disappointments, and in their case, dangers that threaten to overwhelm their daily reality. God's reality, John is saying, is a different and a greater reality. And while the evidence of the current day might lead us to toss in the towel, God has greater plans. And that vision needs to remain in front of us. Again, hope gives us the energy to be disciples. But it's important to acknowledge this about hope as well. By its very nature, the things we hope for have not happened yet. And they are not guaranteed. We hope for things that may be. And we use that hope to create a new world. Now, I'm convinced that nothing we do or don't do will get in the way of God's ultimate vision for God's creation. But I'm also convinced that the things we do or don't do have very real consequences in the immediate moment. And we have the power to heal or to hurt our neighbors in profound ways. So I was thinking of John's vision, this vision we read together this morning of the coming commonwealth of God. I was reminded, and I don't really know why, of another very different vision. I want you to remember with me, if you know it, that scene in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol when Scrooge is visited by the ghost of Christmas future. And as this ghost leads him through various visions of what may be, and the visions get progressively grimmer and grimmer, ending with Scrooge's gravestone, we see Scrooge gradually and then triumphantly embrace a new reality. When he comes to the realization that what he's seen does not have to be, if he can find a way to change himself. John's vision from this morning is sort of an inversion of that. It's a positive vision, not a negative one. But here's the connection. Just as the misfortunes that Scrooge sees do not have to happen, neither are we guaranteed to be the inheritors of that beautiful city from Revelation. We have work to do. And we cannot assume that someone else will do it for us, that we can just sit back and wait for the coming of the kingdom. We are not called to be spectators, but to be disciples. The hope that we hold as a gift from God is not intended to be a palliative. It's not a narcotic. It's not just a painkiller to get us through. It is the food to feed us. I want to leave you with this from the Talmud. I often hear it from my friends that are engaged in God's work for social justice in the world. And if it's not familiar to you, I invite you to take it into your hearts as a daily prayer. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Amen.